Hi, folks. Welcome back to On Call with Insignia, where we go on call with leaders innovating the future of emerging markets all over the world. I'm your host, Paolo Aquino, and we're back with season 7 of On Call. And for this particular episode, we have a pretty interesting guest, I would say, who's had quite a career through fintech, banking. Most recently, has published a work on AI and its implication on the job market and jobs and the nature of jobs in general. So we have none other than with us Trieu. Did I pronounce that correctly, Huy?
Perfect.
Thanks for the pass. But yeah, I have with us Huy, who is the author of the AI-ification of Jobs. He's an entrepreneur, academic investor. He's a co-founder of CFTE, which is basically a global organization really supporting kind of fintech knowledge transfer across different markets and advising CEOs on how to navigate like fintech, really a global fintech education platform. And I think in the most recent SFF, they were a knowledge partner for Singapore FinTech Festival, which is where Huy and I met. Because he also had a book launch there, and we both had a book launch. And I was looking at who else was doing a book launch, and I happened to meet him and his team, and it was great to learn more about the book, how it came about, grab my copy as well. I'm going through it at the moment. It's quite a read, especially if you guys are more, for all the visual folks out there. There are some very illustrative kind of graphics to really show like the points and the frameworks and all that are being discussed. So yeah, be sure to check that out. I'll leave a link to get your copy in the podcast description. But yeah, I'd say this episode is really to get to know the author behind this book and the career that he's led. So Huy, yeah, thank you for coming on the show. I believe you're calling in from Abu Dhabi, right? How is it there these days? Awesome, yeah. So I know you're known for being co-founder of CFTE, but your career actually, you really started as an entrepreneur yourself. I would say way back around like the dot-com era, as many would call it, with a company that you started called Ukibi or Ukibi. Maybe you can share a little bit about that, how you decided to become an entrepreneur yourself, what that experience was like building during that time, and how it shaped kind of your views on entrepreneurship in the years to come.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I've had the chance, as you said, to have different careers in terms of entrepreneurship, but also as a banker, as an investor, part of the ecosystem. And I started actually as an entrepreneur. You asked the question why, was mainly because of MIT. So I was in France, in the US, it was at MIT. And where you were at MIT at that time, which was pretty much at the beginning of 2000, that was let's call that the beginning of the internet. And what you could feel on campus was really this huge trend that was moving. And a lot of the students, a lot of the professors would be involved in some shape and form. So some of them would be entrepreneurs, would have been entrepreneurs. Some of the professors would be investors, would be advisors. So you really felt this huge momentum. And I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur for some reason. But depending on where you are, sometimes in some places it's easier, in some places it's harder. At MIT in the US at that time, it was easy because it felt like everybody was doing it. So there was no thinking about, should I or shouldn't I do? Entrepreneurship is a lot about the risk also. When you overthink the risk, then usually you don't do it. But when you see a lot of people doing it, that's why you did. That's how I started Ukibi. And Ukibi is quite an interesting story because Ukibi was LinkedIn, but 5 years before LinkedIn. So timing was really
I don't know if Reid Hoffman is listening in, but yeah.
And if you're an entrepreneur, that's definitely one of the most important factors to think of, which is timing. I've learned a lot of things from entrepreneurship. I have taught entrepreneurship. I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs. A lot of things are important from the team, the product, etc. But timing is a really important part of it. So that's what I learned from Ukibi. We were lucky, at the end we got an exit, but it was more by chance rather than by any kind of talent. But I learned a lot from that experience, and that's the reason why I've always been involved in entrepreneurship in some way and form since then.
I think that point about timing is really interesting and important, especially with what you wrote about in the book about looking at the historical nature of innovation and how things come into the picture. And I guess having looked back at that whole journey, what would you attribute to why it didn't pan out as you had hoped?
So entrepreneurship, in general, as we know, is really hard. Likelihood of success is, let's say, 10%, depending on where you are, what kind of products you do. I would say that entrepreneurship today and 10 years ago is really different. It's really different. 20 years ago, if you wanted to launch any kind of startup, you needed let's say $1 million. You needed $1 million in order to hire the team, but also to develop your product. Because at that time, it cost a lot in terms of having your hardware, Sun Microsystem computers, for example, your software, Oracle database. Very quickly, it added up to, let's say, $500,000, $1 million. Today, if you wanted to start any kind of company, it would cost $100 per month, perhaps $500 per month.
Subscription to
AWS
or whichever cloud service.
Exactly. So the access to technology, the access to development tools is so much lower. So your barrier to entry has really changed. On the other hand, it makes competition much, much higher. I don't think it makes entrepreneurship any easier. Entrepreneurship is always hard, but your barrier to entry is much lower, which means that everybody could be an entrepreneur today. So I think that's one of the main lessons that I got from there. The other one is the importance of the team. We've always said in entrepreneurship that the team is really important. I think it's even more important today. Because with the team that has the right mindset and the right skills, you could actually build a very large company with a very small team. Entrepreneurs and startups have always been small in terms of teams, but 10, 20 years ago, you needed at least 10, 20, 30, 50 people to start having a big impact, because you needed to have people on the technology side, product development and marketing, etc. Today, with artificial intelligence, you could have a few people who are what I call supercharged, who can actually deliver much, much more than much bigger teams. So that's a second difference, which is the importance of the team becomes much more critical today than a few years ago.
Another great point on the importance of the team, and especially today when you have a lot more choices, right? And it can be analysis paralysis on who exactly is the best person to bring on, or how do you maximize the founding team that you have. And something that we'll get on to later when we're talking about where AI fits into the picture. But first, after you, I guess, exited the company, you fully went into banking, working with the likes of Royal Bank of Scotland, Citi. But what's interesting is you worked in that sector amidst the 08-09 kind of recession, and I think there was a lot of crisis. I think even some banks in the UK as well had to close shop because of that. And I believe also, like, after that period of time, there was a huge wave of fintech unbundling, I think, of the bank, which was an interesting trend. How did your time in banking in particular shape your view on fintech? Because I believe you became more involved in fintech after that part of your career, and like the direction fintech has taken in the years since.
So I've had the chance, which is I absolutely love entrepreneurship. I went into banking not really knowing what was banking. It was pretty much by coincidence. I loved banking also. I had the chance to be part of very good teams in banks, so Societe Generale, then RBS, then Citi. And what I really loved about banking is, let's call that the ability to forecast the future to a little extent. And so, for example, 2008, as part of our group at RBS, we had anticipated the crisis of 2008. Not only had we anticipated and said, there's a risk that we will move into a long-lasting recession, what we call a secular recession, but here are some of the things that we can do to protect ourselves. How did we do it? By analyzing a lot of data, but also by looking back at history and trying to understand what are some of those trends that always happen, and what links to what kind of correlation can you think of, and how can you make sense of all this kind of information. So that's what I really enjoyed in banking, which is you have the ability with a lot of thinking, with a lot of data, to actually understand a bit what might come in the future. Doesn't mean that it's easy to implement, but it is something which is possible because there's a lot of data and historical data in finance. So absolutely loved it. And you're right that there were, let's call that, two parallel worlds. There was the world of parallel or traditional finance, which went through the financial crisis, that after that became extremely regulated, which for a long time became an industry that had to rebuild itself. But what we saw was the emergence, which was happening in parallel, of fintech. And fintech really started because of the crisis of 2008 and the shift in mindset, in consumer behavior of, do I really trust those institutions? No, because we've just been through the biggest crisis which we've ever witnessed. And there needs to be another way. What was the other way? That was the beginning of Bitcoin in 2008. That was the beginning of peer-to-peer lending, of crowdfunding, etc. And so I had the chance of being in traditional finance, but coming from an entrepreneur background. And that's why fintech was quite a nice match. So I started by writing a blog called Disruptive Finance. That was quite followed at that time. teaching also. So I was the first FinTech resident expert at Oxford, where I co-created the Oxford FinTech course, and also being involved in Asia, actually, a founding partner of Supercharged. That was the largest FinTech accelerator in Asia out of Hong Kong. That was led by Janos Barbares. And that was an amazing way to be much closer to the Asian ecosystem. And so that's why during my life in banking, I had this day job, which was banking, and a night job that was FinTech. And that was really fascinating to have both.
So you're kind of part of the system in the day and then kind of like a rebel at night, trying to innovate that same system. But yeah, it's very interesting. I think it's quite a leap actually for, normally you'd have bankers become entrepreneurs, but then you came from entrepreneurship and then joined banking, and then from there went back into kind of entrepreneurship, but in a sort of different capacity, is more of a advisor and investor in some ways. So that leads me into like the next part of your career, which is really supporting fintechs, where you played a more active role in this regard. You did talk earlier about the difference between starting a company 20 years ago and today, but how about 10 years ago? What changed in the 10 years since you did Ukibi and fintech started to emerge in terms of company building? What were the particular challenges of building and scaling fintechs in that time compared to like the challenges today for similar companies?
If we had to look at those three periods, let's say 20 years ago, which there was no fintech, 10 years ago was, let's call that the beginning of fintech, and today, first 10 years ago versus 20 years ago was, as an entrepreneur, you are likely to want to raise money. And the question is, in which kind of environment are you? And sometimes it's really easy to raise money and people will just throw money at you for any kind of idea. And sometimes it's really hard. And I think at the beginning of fintech, it was quite hard to raise money. In terms of some of the numbers, for example, if I remember 2013, 2012, overall fintech investments in the industry were, let's say, $1 billion or less. 5 years later, it was 50 billion, 100 billion. So it was 50 times that. So I think the macro environment in terms of funding makes a big difference. Doesn't make it more successful in terms of your startup, but that's always a really large part of what you do. So I think that's one. Second one is in terms of the technology. 10 years ago, this is when cloud started to appear. This is when SaaS started to appear on a subscription basis, etc. That totally changed the way that you had to launch a company, where before it was a lot of CapEx, capital expenditures, a lot of money that was required to buy machines, for example. And then 10 years later, it was just how much money do you need on a running basis, which you can scale with the number of users that you have. Totally transformed basically the cost of a startup, made it much, much easier to start a startup. What you didn't have at that time for fintech, you didn't have any kind of consumer understanding of what it was. So there was a lot of education to be done, which you might remember some of the first companies on the crowdfunding side or peer-to-peer lending or digital payments like TransferWise, they were quite provocative in their marketing. The reason why they had to be very provocative is that nobody understood what they did. So when you had, for example, TransferWise that had naked people going around London and saying they were transparent on our fees, they had to do it because nobody understood what TransferWise was. Right. There was a lot of consumer education to be done. Fast forward today, what has changed? What has changed is that fintech is really well established. Even though words, people understand what it means, and consumer adoption is much bigger. So that makes it much easier. It makes it also, I would say, much more competitive because it's a much bigger space, much bigger market. But what has happened in terms of your initial investment has even gone down further, which means that 10 years ago, let's say you needed $200,000 to start your startup. Today, you could almost start with nothing, $5,000, $10,000, much less, because a lot of the tools now are much more sophisticated, much more powerful, much cheaper. And because of that, you require fewer people, which is one of your main costs. So I think that's mainly one. The other one is that fintech is part of financial services. And because it's part of financial services, it's a highly regulated environment. And years ago, there were very few regulations in fintech that made it harder to know in what kind of environments you had to navigate. Today, it has become much clearer because regulators have actually been very involved in the process. So it makes it easier to understand if you're within or outside of several frameworks. And I'll finish on the last one, which is really important, is that 10 years ago, you didn't know how to make money from fintech. wasn't clear. It wasn't clear if you launch a company, would you be making money from subscription? Would you be making money from interchange fees? Would you be making money from transformation, for example, from lending versus borrowing? It wasn't clear at all. And that's a really, really important question for a startup. Today, we have a good idea because we've had thousands of fintech startups. And so we have a much better idea of what works and what doesn't work in terms of business models.
And I think there's a lot more exit stories as well. So there's a whole various playbooks to look at, all the way from payment gateways to digital banks. There's people can name sort of success stories and in these kind of different pockets of fintech. I did have a follow-up question about competition, how it's evolved in the last 10 years. Would you say how much of it now is more of really just about kind of distribution and having the right license and being in the right markets as opposed to the tech advantage of it all, given how more democratized it is to build these kinds of solutions?
That's a really good question. I think that there's really little tech advantage today in fintech. The tech is quite well known. As you said, we have much, much more experience. There's a playbook for fintech and for how do you develop fintech. So what we're seeing now is much more fintech that was extremely localized in some countries, the UK, for example, then Singapore and Hong Kong, the US, of course, a very large market. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing fintech being localized, but to all countries around the world. And there's enough today in terms of critical mass to be able to launch fintech startup for a specific country. It could be France, for example, or it could be in the Philippines, it could be in Saudi, and for them to do really well because, again, consumer adoption, because technology is much easier, because business models are much more well known, and to be able to grow those companies in the same way as you have banks, which are domestic banks, which are really big banks. Now you have the opportunity to do fintechs, which are domestic fintechs that can become really big. So what we're seeing is really this localization trend, which started pretty much 4 or 5 years ago, but across all countries in the world. So that will continue for a long time.
Considering how, I guess there's a thesis globally of how much opportunity there still remains in terms of you have this whole narrative about financial inclusion and the unbanked and the underbanked. And as much as fintech has grown in the last decade, there still seems to remain a lot of kind of like untapped market opportunity when it comes to financial services and making this accessible. And that leads me into like the fourth chapter of your career, coming from entrepreneur to banker and then investor advisor. Now, really, I would say more of an academic researcher, educator, thought leader, with you founding CFTE, the Center for Finance, Technology, and Entrepreneurship, which I feel like is culmination of everything you've been doing since. What made you decide to actually start this platform and really build it out to the global presence that it is today?
It's really two things. The first one, I mentioned I was a fintech resident and expert at Oxford. So I co-created the Oxford FinTech course. It was a really good course, but not everybody can afford Oxford. And that's the reason why we launched CFTE with the objective of education at scale, making sure that everybody around the world could have access to very good knowledge. Because the reality is that today, knowledge can and should be democratized. So that was really one. The other one, I'm one of the two co-founders. Traman is my other co-founder. And Traman comes from traditional finance. She knows very little about technology. And so when she started to see all my discussions around fintech, she said, there's really something which is happening and I'm not a part of it. And all the people like me who know very little about technology should be a part of it. And that's the reason why we launched CFT. And as you've said, it's a combination of a lot of things, but the most important mission of CFT is that in a world which is very heavily driven by technology, every single person should have access to this knowledge and make sure that they are part of this transformation. What we do not want is all these amazing technological shifts, whether it's AI or others, impacting all of us, and then some people being a part of this amazing transformation, and a lot of people who feel like they're not part of it because they don't like math or don't have a STEM background, feel like it shouldn't be something that they care about. But the reality is that everybody should be a part of it because it's much, much more accessible today.
And speaking of making this kind of insight and knowledge open source, that leads me into the book, right? Which you recently published, the AI-ification of Jobs, which I guess is a broader topic than I guess I would have expected you to really cover, but then I guess it's really timely as well. What was the motivation for you to actually start writing this book? Was there a particular moment, or were you just like looking at the trend and trying to give your own take on what's been happening?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question because that's true that CFT is extremely specialized in finance,
Yeah.
technology, entrepreneurship. So this is really, our domain of expertise. The AI-ification of jobs is much broader in the sense of it's not just about finance, it's really about jobs, in general. The reality, however, is that we've been involved in AI for the last 5 years, 6 years now, where we created the first AI certification in finance in 2018 with
Right.
Nguyen Polytechnic in Singapore. So we've been involved in the space for a long time. At that time, we were already saying AI, single most important technology impacting financial services. By extension, actually, it impacted all industries. So we've been, very vocal and very convinced about it. However, with ChatGPT 2 years ago, we started to see something that was really different. That was the impact was becoming so much bigger. It was starting to be harder to understand what the future will be. And for us as educators, it's really important to have an idea of the future. You can only prepare people to do really well
Right.
if you have an idea of what the future will be. Otherwise, how do we prepare them? And when we started to look more into this, there's of course a lot of reports and research about this, but none which really answered the question which was important for us, which is, as an individual, what do I need to learn? And for that, what are the jobs that will be coming in the future? What are the jobs that will be transformed? What are the jobs that will disappear? And when we start looking into this, we realize that it's a really difficult question. And that's the reason why I spent 10 months working on this book, on this research, and that led to the AI-ification of jobs.
It's quite I really appreciate like the holistic perspective, really comparing this AI, really generative AI phenomenon versus other kind of revolutions that we've had, or innovation or industrial revolutions that we've had in the past. And I think one of the conclusions you make in the book is that this time is different, especially this particular transformation that we're undergoing. How does that sentiment extend to entrepreneurship in particular? And what are the kinds of, I guess the obvious conclusion is that it's easier to build a company today, especially with Gen AI. But like, how does the mindset or the skill sets have to change for entrepreneurs today?
Yeah, definitely. So this time is different. That was one of the questions of the book, which is, have we seen it before, or this time is different?
Yeah.
This time is different. This time is different for a lot of reasons. But whatever you think of AI, I think it's important to realize that there's a very strong likelihood that we will be in, let's call that a new era, which we've never seen before. And so rethinking about what we want to do is really critical. What about entrepreneurs? So in the book, I identified 3 really important trends of what is likely to come because of artificial intelligence. The first trend is the supercharged professionals. Those people will do really well because they combine domain expertise with understanding of technology. And you need both. One is not sufficient. Domain expertise would go, for example, traditional finance, not sufficient anymore. But just understanding of technology, again, not sufficient, because a lot of that can be done by machines today. So combining both, really important. The second trend is mass displacement, which is that AI is starting to be better than actually a lot of people. On average, we're all average. AI is starting to be better than the average. And so some people will fall behind because they cannot compete with AI anymore, mass displacement. And the third one is what I call the creative disruptors. Those very few people in the world who will make a humongous impact on all of us. Think of Sam Altman, for example. Think of Demis Hassabis, the new Nobel Prize CEO of DeepMind, who with AlphaFold totally transformed, not AI, transformed chemistry and biology. So those people who are leveraging AI and to totally transform different industries. What does it mean for entrepreneurs? For entrepreneurs, it's really about how do you fall into the category of supercharged professionals. And supercharged professionals is about leveraging a certain domain expertise, certain understanding of a domain with technology and the ability to do not 50% better or more than before, 5 times more, 10 times more, 100 times more, because you could actually start to automate a lot of your stack, use AI agents to do a lot of things that you couldn't do before, whether it's market research or product design or customer relationship, etc. So for entrepreneurs, I think what is really important is this part of supercharged professionals of having the right mindset, because doing 10% more, 50% more That's good, but that's the old mindset. The new mindset is, can I do something that instead of taking me 10 hours, it's going to take me 1 minute? Possible. There's nothing that says that you can't do something that used to take 10 minutes, 10 hours in 1 minute. So that's really around the mindset. And the second one is about really using the tools. A lot of people, of course, are users of the tools, whether it's ChatGPT or others. The reality is that ChatGPT is 1% of what you can do today. You can do so much more. The part which is your own skills becomes so much more important today than before. Before, it was a lot about finding the right team members, making sure you had a good balance in the team members, trying to find skills that would complement yours. Today, you might actually want to spend much more time in building your own skills. There's no reason why not all of us can be very good at digital marketing or storytelling or product design or etc. You won't become an expert in all of this, but you can be good enough so that what you need in a startup, which is your MVP, can be almost done but just by yourself.
And so where do the lines of competition come in when hypothetically everybody can be good at a particular thing, right? And supercharge themselves, as you mentioned.
So we've seen that trend for a long time already. So for the last 20 years, we've had more and more competition. So I don't think that's going to change. We will continue more and more competition. But on the other hand, I think we'll see more, let's call that inequality in the competition side. Which is that the difference before could have been 1 to 5, 1 to 10. Perhaps you will see a difference of 1 to 100, which is some people or some organizations can do so much better than others because they will just leverage technology so much more. So I think you will see competition, but you will see also this kind of winner takes all that happen much more often than
I think one of your co-authors you jokingly mentioned is ChatGPT. I won't dig too deep into how exactly, I'll let you guys read the book to find out how exactly ChatGPT played into putting the book together. But I guess if it was made in 10 months with that much scope, then yeah, I'll let you guys make your own conclusions from there. But yeah, just to wind down
just to be fair, we said there were 3 people or 3 members in the team, and ChatGPT was one, and definitely ChatGPT was a really important part of it. But the other one is Ria, our analyst in the Singapore office, and Ria is a human, so she's not a machine, but she's spectacular as a human. And so, for example, she did all the illustrations in the book. So she was my sparring partner for this whole project.
Yeah, awesome. Shout out to Rhea for connecting myself and Huy as well and making this conversation possible. Speaking of which, as we wind down, I just wanted to bring things full circle and going back to your time starting Ukibi. If you were to, and it's more of a hypothetical question, if you were to start your own venture today, having seen what you've seen, is there anything that you feel especially passionate about that you would want to build from the experience that you've had?
So many things to build today. I think it's one of the most exciting times to be in entrepreneurship, or actually in a lot of industries, because it's a world of change. So if you're an entrepreneur, you like change. So we're really in a world of change. It's happening really quickly. That means there's a lot of opportunities. Where would I focus on? I think I would want to focus on things that have a real impact. This is what we're doing at the moment. That's on the education side. What can have a real impact today? Climate, of course. I think climate, we should, and for all the entrepreneurs out there, it's important, of course, but it's also a huge business opportunity. There will be so much capital getting into this. So everybody should get into climate. If of course, AI important, everybody's talking about it, but climate is also a huge opportunity for the planet and for you as an entrepreneur. What I would do if I wanted to be an entrepreneur today, what I think I would do, I would spend 3 months doing nothing except building my skills. So I would spend
going back to Supercharged.
Exactly. Learning as much as I can, using as many tools as I can, learning about other topics, whether it's digital marketing or products or how to survey people, etc., and combine it with the tools. Because after that, you would have, I think, a much, much bigger head start than others for launching your startup.
Yeah, and I guess more of these, one person companies or enterprise, which should be interesting. Thank you so much, Huy, for coming on call with us. If you do want to check out his book, AI-ification of Jobs, do check the podcast description below for a link to get your copy. Follow him on LinkedIn as well for more updates on what he's working on at CFTE. And stay connected, guys, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.
Bye.